Hello.
Hello, Eric. Just giving everyone a couple of minutes to join.
Cool.
Have you had a busy day?
Um, it's not been too bad. We have some releases going out, so I've had to babysit some stuff, but otherwise not too bad.
That's good.
How about you?
Yeah, I've actually, thanks for the link to the, is it called the cube builder?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I've started on the tutorials for the cron job. And I have some questions for you probably later when we go through the design doc.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I've been just like looking at that today. Yeah, they have a pretty good tutorial. And I was kind of like, what one thing it didn't, I didn't realize before is like the controllers can be deployed separately to like as a separate deployment on your cluster.
The controllers, you mean like like the pods, you mean? Yeah. So like if you look at Gatekeeper, that's pretty much what gets deployed. Like when you deploy Gatekeeper, you see like there's two pods. There's like an audit pod, and then there's like the main Gatekeeper pod, and that's pretty much all the main Gatekeeper pod is a it's just a queue builder like service. So it just sits there and listens to CRDs and admission requests.
So if we were to write our like our CRD, how do we interact with like the Ratify existing pod?
So we would kind of have two options. One would be that instead of having a separate controller, we have it run in process. So we would have one pod, kind of similar to how Gatekeeper works, where they have one pod they have two, but the other one's an audit, so we'll just ignore that for now. But they have one pod, and it listens to both admission requests and the CRDs. And that works nicely for them because they both sort of work the same way. In our case, it doesn't, but we can follow that same pattern where we have one pod that one listens to CRDs and one listens to API for external data requests. So then it would all be in process, and then any updates that have to happen would happen, to just the in-memory data structures. So that simplifies things a decent amount because we don't have to come up with a bunch of plumbing to go between pods.
Yeah.
So that would probably be the easiest way to do it. And we would just have like a flag where you would say, oh yeah, you're spawning the controller like as a go routine, and you would have to have a handle to the shared configuration, and then you would just update it and mutex it, and then it could be shared between requests and this controller.
Cool. So their example, I only found the one where it's deploying as a separate pod, but I'll look for another example somewhere, maybe like to show how to run in the same process.
Yeah. If you look at, I don't know who else does it. I mean, Gatekeeper is kind of like looking at that it could be helpful. So it's not quite the same, but it is similar. But yeah, a lot of the examples you're probably likely to find are like the operator pattern. So they will be a little less helpful because those sort of watch CRDs, but then they spawn like new like net new stuff based on the CRD. So I assume for lifecycle support, they handle if you update an existing like object, like CRD object. So could look at that, but I don't know how they do that off the top of my head.
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about that a little later. So let's get started. I think we have a few PRs from the. Hello, Xinghe. It's good to have you on the call today.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. It's my first time to join.
Yeah, welcome. We see that you created an issue on the Get Started CLI.
Yeah, it's just about when I trying this quick CLI, I met some issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Bin have responded to the thread. Do you have any additional questions on that issue?
In fact, besides the question I mentioned in the issue, I still did not successfully run all of it. The final result I get is final result I get is verification failed, no reference found for this artifact. Is this normal?
For our startup,
Yeah.
for the quick start,
let me type the link. Wait a minute.
Yeah. To me, that would indicate. So what do we do when we go to check on a? Are you sure that the artifact got pushed successfully to the registry? Because that's where you would probably hit that. Is if you had no artifacts in the registry, when the request comes in, we go ask the registry for all the artifacts, and then if there are none,
you mean use the ORAC to push the artifact?
Correct. Yeah.
I think I have uploaded it because when I'm running Ratify Discover, it returns the result, but the Ratify Verify not work.
I see. Okay.
For that, you will have to use notation to push the signature on the image and configure the key, and that's pretty much what that workflow is.
Yeah, but I have two error warning. I'll attach it. Wait a minute. I got.
Would it be helpful if you want to share screen?
Oh, okay, sure. Let me find how to share it on the Zoom. Sorry.
So I've made you a host, and then you'll see like a green button on Zoom to share screen, hopefully.
Green button. Oh, okay, see it. Thank you. Yeah. Can you see my screen for now?
Not quite. I think it's trying.
When you share screen, do you see like a selection? Yes, we can see it now.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great. Yes. So I copied all the scripts from the quick start CLI, and I'm not using local registry, but using an ACL registry. So when I'm trying to run it, it have several error message.
Which region is your registry in?
Let me check.
That
it is
that matters, right?
Australia Southeast.
Okay.
Yeah. So I got several error message of, for example, the first one is when notation tries to generate the, I think it is here, notation search generate test, and it get error that the private key does not match the public key. Is the key he tries to use is my local local key, or it's generate a new key?
It's generating a new key pair.
Yeah,
Okay.
This is like a wrapper around like X509. So it says your file already exists. So did you potentially try to run that more than once?
You mean delete it? Yes, I tried it.
Yeah.
But still the same.
And then if you remove the private.
You can see still have this error message. And another question I made is here. If can when I trying to run the verify, it has a message, warning message that I do not have a Ratify certs. So
Right.
do I need
So-
any other steps to create it?
So that directory there is, where are you storing? It says one notary verification certificate loaded from path above that. So your certificate was successfully loaded from there. And then we have a default path in the Ratify directory that we check for certificates. And if
Okay,
it's
so
warning because
I need to pass this path into into the verify command.
no, because you can see there that it loaded the certificate from that path. So if you provided that path as part of the config, it loaded successfully. The next line, the warning there is just saying that I assume you didn't call make install, because make install actually creates that Ratify certs directory. So that directory might not exist, but it doesn't necessarily matter if you are if you're changing the config to load the certs from somewhere else, then it doesn't matter.
Yes, if I do not have this config file config path, it will report error.
Right, because you shouldn't report an error, but
yes, you can see error here. So I
see.
I put it the config here.
see.
So
Interesting.
Yeah.
Does notation verify work even before you try Ratify? Because
Notation, you mean the notation sign and notation cert generate?
there's one more command called notation verify, which you can run and check if that is not working. You want to do a live debugging and just check if you are able to see the images using ORAS, like just do ORAS discover on that specific tag?
Yeah, in fact, I'm just running the quick start command here, and just submit several questions here. So
Sure.
I think this document may need some update, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. One thing I did see, and I don't know if this would have an impact, but if you're using a remote registry, you don't need the plain HTTP flag, since Azure registries will use SSL.
So the HTTP flag only works for the local registry, correct?
Right. Things that don't have TLS termination use that flag.
Okay,
So-
I will try it. Thank you.
Just curious, Xinghe, the registry is a anonymous pool enabled, or does it require some sort of authentication?
No, I create this ACR directly. I thought it should be notary enabled. I remember the Shui or David used to tell me that ACR has already by default enabled Ratify. I can also change to the local one.
Yeah, I think for ACR, it has to be a particular SKU. And then
Okay.
you have, there's a configuration to actually enable that.
I think it's already rolled out everywhere. You should be able to do even the basic also.
Okay.
For public?
Yeah.
I see, okay.
So in
Yeah.
the portal, if you click on the tag, do you have the image? Maybe we can quickly just verify. In the Azure portal, if you click on the image, right?
Mhm. Oh, wait a minute. It's right.
Yeah, so click on that specific repository.
Sorry, a bit slow.
And there, if you click on that V1 artifacts, can you click on the tab above? Yep. So there is
Okay, so
there
the
is-
artifact has did not successfully upload.
correct. You need something
Okay.
push that will enable that to.
Get it. Thank you.
So that notation sign should push that artifact, and you should be able to see that.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I will test it later.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, Xinghe, feel free to ping us in the internal channels if you are still blocked.
Okay. Sure thing. Let me stop the shell.
Okay, let me reshare my screen. Okay, I have to take control back first. On our agenda today, so I think something I did put a link on the design doc, but I think that has been overwritten. But actionable agenda item: discuss Kubernetes add-on with Ratify. So let me go into that one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what we were just talked about. I thought we'll also run through our open PRs. Just a quick rundown. I think everything, the top 4, I think we can just merge them in and do a pre-release validation as we discussed previously.
Yep, sounds good.
Yep.
And for the last one, because the bot labeled it review, I think it's the same. Is it different? It just says review required. I guess we just submit a approval. Akash, are you happy
Yeah.
to bump this up?
Yeah, this one should be fine. This has to do with the auto updating the GitHub pages action. So it's a minor bump, so it should be okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I will merge them after this meeting.
Sounds good.
Yep. And continuing the other agenda item I had was to continue our design CRD discussion. Does anyone else have any quick items that we should cover before we continue the lengthy CRD discussion? Okay, if not, I will just go to the design doc. So last week, we talked about providing a new set of Ratify CRDs to enable a more native experience. One of the things we weren't I wanted to clarify with David actually, because he mentioned a verifier plus certificate CRD versus a verifier / store CRD. So Eric and Akash, does that ring a bell? I thought we were on that we're going to group the certificates with the verifier, but we're still going to have separate CRDs for the store, the verifier, and possibly the policy.
Yeah, I think that was what we had discussed earlier. I'm not sure how much it makes sense to club both the verifier and the store together.
Yeah, I feel like a single responsibility object would be a more flexible design.
Yep.
And I think we had a question about could the CRD scope to a namespace? And I think like there is a namespace property in all the CRDs. So one of the question I had was like, if we were to make a separate CRD for the store and to support multi-tenancy in the future, let's say we have like different registries we would pull from depending on the namespace, then we will need to add a property for like today we don't have a client ID if we're using Azure Workload Identity. Is that correct, Akash? Like it'll use the service account that Ratify is running under?
Yep. Yeah. So it uses the service account, and through that, workload identity is paired up with that. So I do know that the CSI driver, when you migrated it over to Azure Workload Identity, that requires the client ID, right? I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So
assuming the service account should not have access to all the private registry. So maybe another property that we should add in the Azure Workload Identity is the client ID will be used to pull the artifacts.
yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
Yeah, so I've just taken what Lee had. So for the store, we would have the name of the store, and today we only kind of support RS only.
Yep.
And the authentication mode.
For verifier for the CRD there. So like depending on the verifier, we're gonna have like type and artifact type, you know, every verifier CRD might have that. But for the remainder of the fields, the idea is that they'd have like different information there. So the CRD would not be uniform, right? So like a way, how does that actually get expressed? Like, is there just like a type artifact type and then like extras type thing, and then you know if you put whatever you want in there, and the verifier, like your controller will understand what to do. Do you know how that actually like looks? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Like typically we can have different, in the object-oriented world, we can have different classes versus having one class that would have like optional properties.
Yeah. Like I'm thinking about from like a constraint, like if you think about the way that gatekeeper CRDs work, like they have the constraints and the constraint templates, and like the constraint template lets you parameterize certain things and provide like different data and define like an open API schema for how things are provided. And so that works, but like the schema of the constraint template of the like actual object that you provide is like uniform. So I just maybe I'm like way overthinking this, but I'm like, is that going to be like, is it going to work to like have it that way, where like one CRD that represents verifier has like, you know, object type, and then because how would the controller actually consume that? Like you'd look at the type and then you deserialize the, I mean, I guess if it's JSON, it doesn't matter, but yeah, I'm just thinking about like, are there examples where other people do it that way?
I haven't gone through enough examples, but can you just remind me which fields are different? So they all have artifact type, and they'll all have validation certificates, but the license is different, right? Like the license checker would have.
Yeah. So like for type, as an example, like for Notary v2, yeah, like it has the notary signature artifact type, and then the other configuration items that it cares about is verification certs Whereas SBOM or the license checker verifier don't care about that. They have their own like language. Like, so if we go to like our verifiers in the source code and you look at like every verifier has their own definition for the way the config looks, and they deserialize the passed in like JSON into their own config type. So like that would be the type of thing that like we would end up expressing as the CRD for verifier. And if that's like normal to do, then maybe that's not a big deal. But otherwise, maybe that would be one point in favor of having like one standardized CRD type for verifiers with like uniform fields, and then like another CRD that you could use to like augment that verifier.
Mm. So like a validation certificate would be not in the base.
Yeah, because that's verifier specific. Like any verifier specific configuration, does it make sense to have like a polymorphic field in the verifier CRD, essentially?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Like I will do some research and see how other sample projects, let me know if you have any suggestions, Eric.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find any that have a good example.
Yep. Yeah, and the other component we have is the policy. So potentially that can be its own CRD.
I think that could be, and I think we should revisit building like still separating the different types of policy providers. So, and building like an OPA provider for that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, but I think yes, the store and the verifier, like they're the obvious ones to convert into CRDs. And I have a question like on Ratify initialization. So once we have the CRDs and the configuration file, like which one overrides, like which one do we
I would
ratify with?
like which one do we care about, essentially?
Yeah,
if
yeah.
Yeah, my opinion would be that if we use a configuration file, then that's what's loaded at startup. And if people add CRDs, then we essentially, if people use CRDs, we only use the configuration file one time. So you're essentially, the configuration file you provide is a starting point, and then that will get mutated depending on the CRDs that you apply. I think ideally people should start with an empty config and then apply CRDs so that everything is like coming from CRDs only, so that there's no confusion about like, oh, my CRDs did this, but your starting point was actually like half of an existing config. And so then it's probably harder to understand how, what your current configuration looks like based on a collection of CRDs and your starting JSON.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. So like load in the configuration file and then read in the CRDs, which would possibly mutate the executor.
Right.
Yeah, and we talked about multi-tenancy a little bit last week, like how like that'll result in like multiple configuration and stuff. So with the CRDs, because you can scope each object to its namespace, are we thinking like we can have like a map of namespace and then executor, like every namespace will have its own executor, or inside the executor will have like namespace mapping to a list of store verifiers, but we can just put that mapping at some level.
Yeah, I would think does it make sense to carry multiple, like if let's say you have a configuration and you have a verifier, and you can just pass that configuration into a verifier and then call verify. Like then it makes sense. Oh, you can just store, you know, a map of configs of a map of a map, essentially. So like for this namespace, here's the config, and this config has XYZ verifier configurations, and then that's how you could store them. So it probably just, we'd have to look at like how much space, like what's the overhead of storing a bunch of verifiers that are pre-initialized. It might end up being a lot, and with the changes that we're making to support like gRPC based verifiers, so maybe if you have a verifier that's like an external process that is long lived, maybe it doesn't make sense to store verifiers. You store configurations so you can provide them. So but yeah, that would be the idea. It's like essentially just mapping namespaces to sets of configurations.
Yeah. Okay, going through, I think David added some additional questions. So I think we haven't discussed this one. That is it common or not use case where you'd really need different verifier config to use the same exact store certificates?
I guess what is he asking?
Yeah, what does that mean?
What's the question?
Is that like multiple verifiers that actually use the same config, or what is that?
Yeah, if this is like a space, is it a space question? Like, oh, if we have the same verifier over and over and over, it doesn't make sense to do it that way, or is it common or not use case where you'd really need different verifier configs to use the exact same store?
Yeah, like today you can have notary and then the cosign verifier that uses the same store, right?
Yeah. So one scenario I could think of, and maybe this isn't that common, but like for people who have containers in different registries, if those registries use different credentials, then it would make sense to have two. But if you were thinking about using Ratify without, or using the containers in cluster anyways without using Ratify, you would still have to either use one cluster principal that has access to both registries, or you would have to have everybody manage client secrets, like for like image pull secrets. So from that perspective, that's the only case in which I'm like, oh yeah, storing a bunch of different ones makes sense if every team is managing their, like if there's a multi-tenant scenario where every team is managing image pull secrets for their own registry separately, then yeah, it would make sense to have to do that. But otherwise, like one registry client would make the most sense to me.
Yep.
And then for the certs, I guess the same thing. Like if you have a list of, like if you're trying to validate containers that are signed, and you just make a giant list of certs from every team, so you have one notary verifier with a bunch of certs in it, then yeah, that could technically work. However, there are security implications there. Like if team A has namespace A and they care that their containers were signed with their certificates, then if we glob all the certs into one verifier, then technically you could deploy a container that was signed by cert B in namespace A, because the verifier would still be happy. So I still think it does make sense to support more than one for both of these hypothetical cases that I think this question pertains to, but we'll have to ask David.
Yeah. I'm just trying to read the next question about, I think the next question is about the performance implications for multiple verifier with the same store.
Does this have any performance implications? If we if we stored handles and instead of just storing configs, we initialized a bunch of verifier objects and a bunch of store objects, and we stored them in a giant map. Like, if they were pre-initialized, there's technically not from a time perspective, there's not a performance overhead. I mean, you'll have to dereference the correct verifier from the map, but after you do that, like they're all pre-allocated, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, it will take up more space to store a bunch of them, but that I wouldn't see that as a huge concern.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense to me. I will, I'll let David know that in the notes we've touched on these questions. And I've added the next two. Like we were talking earlier, Eric, that the Cube Builder example was like deploying the controller as a separate pod. So then, so the next item that I need to look into is how to deploy the controller kind of along with Ratify, so we can access these things in memory. So then if we were to, it's kind of related to the, like, if we're going to leverage the CSI driver as well, like if we implemented our own key vault retrieval logic, then potentially we don't need the volume mount. We can just kind of load it in memory since we're running in process. Like, is that one advantage?
That we would, yeah. So the advantage would be that we don't have to have, like, if we have a running Ratify container or pod that's separate, and then we have our controller separately. If our controller sees an update to CRD, it would have to communicate this configuration change to a separate pod. You know, be that updating the pod, be that rolling the pod, or us building some API that could be used. Yeah, the advantage would be if it's in the same container, then we would just be doing in-memory updates. Be convenient.
Yeah. I will look into finding some examples to do that. Yeah, and last week we weren't really clear on, like, okay, we decided to move forward with the certificate plus verifier CRD, but we weren't clear on, are we going to leverage in the existing CSI driver in any way? And I know Eric said, like, it'll be a weird architecture if we try to do that. And
yeah.
like if we were doing it ourselves, like there's also the advantage of loading it in memory instead of doing the volume mount.
Yeah, not having to do volume mounts. Yeah, if we're doing our own CRDs, we just stay away from volume mounts, and we would do it all with our own plugins or our own implementation.
Yeah, I'm happy to explore that. Does anyone else have any feedback on, like, writing our own key vault logic?
How much redundant work is that? Just curious. Like,
that would essentially be all of the like life cycle implementation that exists today for CSI driver, like periodically checking for new versions, authenticating and interacting with secret providers from whatever CSPs want to support Ratify. That would be it.
Okay.
So it'd be a decent amount, but
I could also try to reach out to the secret store CSI driver team just to see, what is their suggestion? Like, how do we avoid duplicating work, but still have PRD?
I mean, if we could because like a nice thing would be if we were running the controller and we had the file watcher. So like if we ran the controller out of process, so it was in its own pod, and we could like essentially hot mount CSI drivers to the running Ratify pod, and we had file watcher, then we can then we could support using CSI driver, the store driver still, but I don't know if that works.
That's the flex mount scenario you were discussing, right?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. I think my understanding is if you do anything to change mounts, you cannot do that to a running pod. I might be wrong there, but I don't think you can add or remove them. But if you make a mount prior, then some other thing can affect what is in the mount. But I don't think you can add or remove them to running pods.
I see. So that's like kind of like a limitation for using the CSI driver.
Yes, yeah. So the limitation would be that we would essentially be signed up to roll the pod every time. It's whenever we got a CRD. So we would essentially become an operator at that point, because whenever a change came in, we would be creating a new Ratify pod and replacing the existing one, which isn't necessarily bad, but it would just be different, I suppose.
Okay, I can confirm these 2 points. Like I can schedule, like I'll see when their office hour or community meeting is, and I can just confirm our understanding. Yep. So okay. Yeah, I think that's the 2 next steps for me. So talk to the CSI driver to see, like, to confirm the limitation, and like to see if they have any suggestion on how to leverage their project to reduce redundancy. And the other one is to look in, I want to look for an example where how to run a controller in process. Okay, that's everything I had. I know Kara have sent out like a design doc for some of the changes they're proposing. I haven't gone through that in detail yet, but we can talk about it maybe at the next session. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yep. Does anyone have anything else? Okay. Yeah, hopefully we'll see Jimmy soon. I think he is on vacation for the summer. He let me know he will be off for 3 weeks. Hopefully he'll come back. And I would also be off next week. So Akash, would you be able to run the community meeting next week?
Yep. Yeah, I can take that.
Yeah, thanks. It'll be on the Wednesday schedule.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, folks. Sorry about all the messages on Slack. I was trying to set up a reminder and it became like almost like a spam.
Okay, I haven't checked what's happening on Slack. Okay.
Thank goodness.
Same.
Right.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.